Hi, Misha here, and as I've said in a couple of videos, the bulk of the Eaglemoss Warships Collection are Japanese ships in 1,100 scale diecast. There are a lot of them, and it's going to take me quite a long while to work through them all. And I was kind of debating where to begin, and with that I decided just to kind of begin at the beginning with the first warships, the first battleships in the Japanese Navy, and the ones that took part in the Ruso-Japanese War. Today we've referred to these as pre-dreadnoughts, but this type of ship, this style of ship, was pretty common, very ubiquitous in the late 19th century, and what replaced the famous ironclads. They had metal armor, typically a front and rear turret with 2 guns, with calibers in the really 11 to 13 inch range, although there were some extremers, other ones, and then a secondary battery of 4 to 8 inch guns, usually not any kind of turret. And I don't just mean for Japan. If anything, they copied a lot of the naval tactics of others, and early on these ships were built for them all in United Kingdom, so to the British plan. But even when you look at, say, French and German designs, they pretty much all look the same. Even though the details are different. So we have 3 different models here that are technically different classes, although just barely. And then we're going to look at, just for comparison, the Russian Borodino class from the war. They had a very short service. Now the one I don't have, the one that Eaglemoss doesn't do, is the Fuji class. But I'm going to talk about it briefly because this was the first modern warship that the Japanese Navy had. They initially ordered 2, Fuji and Shima, from Britain in 1894. And these were laid down and delivered in 1897 and entered into the Japanese service. By this time, Japan had fought with China and won the First Sino-Japanese War. This was important because, for one thing, it gave them a certain naval ambition and was their first step on becoming more of a global power. But it also gave them a lot of money. When China lost the war, and because of a dispute over Port Arthur, a very large reparation or indemnity was paid, and Japan used most of this to continue buying ships and modernizing its fleet. So getting started with the 2 Fuji classes, which were based on the British Sovereign class, which was the most modern British ship of the time. Next, they would order 2 ships of the Shikishima class, and there would be, of course, the Shikishima and then the Hetsus in this, so 2 more ships for a total of 4 ordered. And these would be a similar design but a little bit bigger. They would have 4 more secondary guns, and they would be based on a modified Majestic class, again built in Britain. By the way, the Fuji and the Shikishimas would have 4 12-inch guns, 2 turrets, front and rear, and then on the side, the Fuji would have had a total of 10 6-inch guns. Like I said, the Shikishima would have 14, plus some smaller secondary guns. They would also have 4 to 5 torpedo tubes. And this second class would be delivered between 1900 and 1901, and of course therefore be ready for the Ruso-Japanese War. The Fujiis were about 412 feet long. The Shikishima were just under 440 feet long, so a little bit bigger, which makes sense for the extra guns. And again, both had a top speed of a little over 18 knots. And of course, these were powered by coal at that time. So Japan was off to a good start. But with the budget it had, it started off a 10-year plan known as the 6-6 plan, where they wanted to have 6 battleships along with 6 what we would think of as battle cruisers. So at this point they have 4. The 1898 naval budget allowed for ships number 5 and 6 to be ordered from Britain. Again, these would be very similar to what was being used by the Royal Navy. The first one was the Asahi. And the second one, number 6, the final one ordered from Britain, was the, I can't pronounce this, but anyway, Mikasa. Mikasa, sorry. But they are actually 2 different classes. They're very similar, but they are technically different classes of ship. Both are based on the Formidable. Now, interestingly, in Britain, the Royal Navy was presented with 2 slightly different versions of the Formidable, and one had 2 more secondary guns than the other. And while the Royal Navy went with the one with 12 instead of 14, the Japanese opted for the 14 secondary gun models. Also, somewhat interestingly, these are shorter than the ones based on the Majestic. The smallest is the Asahi at about 425 feet, and the Mikasa is about 430 feet. But whereas the one over here is about 12,500 tons, these are both, excuse me, the Fuji was 12,500 tons. The Shikishima was 14, nearly 15,000 tons, and the last 2 designs were a bit over 15,000 tons, but all again have a speed of about 18 knots, and all have the same armament, very similar. Originally, the Fuji would have a crew of 650, the Shikishima would have around 740, the next 2 would have 775, and the Mikasa would have over 800 because it was intended to be a flagship. Although I can't talk now. Sorry, it's late. Although the Asahi would have a role as a flagship as well. They're all just so darn similar. They really are. But that was just kind of the design at the time. Well, the Asahi was built and delivered in 1900, and the Mikasa was delivered in 1902, thus completing Japan's initial 6-6 plan, and really kind of being amongst the last Japanese battleships to be both designed and fully built outside of Japan. Of course, later we would have the Congo class, but that's a little bit different situation. And these would all form the core of the Japanese fleet, leading into the Ruso-Japanese War. So let's just briefly talk about what Russia was bringing to the table. Now, this is the only one that's in the Eaglemoss collection, the Borodino class. But really, this is the only major battleship, was certainly the largest battleship of the type, and definitely the newest. It was kind of hard to be any newer than these were. And 4 were used in the war. So the Borodino class was designed in the 1890s, or at least the idea came from the 1890s, and the design was based on French battleships at the time, but modified for Russian techniques and built in Russia. The exact design was finalized in the summer of 1898, and construction would begin a short time thereafter. And when the Ruso-Japanese War began in 1904, none of them, of the 5 planned, were ready to go. But of the 5, 4 of them were far enough along they were able to rush them out and give them really hastened trials and get them on the way to the Far East where they were needed. Basically, this would be the Borodino, the Alexander III, the Suvorov, and the Oreo. The one that didn't make it was the Slava. She would not actually be ready until after the peace treaty had been signed, which for her was honestly a good thing considering the outcome. Again, it's a very similar design, even if the details are very different. It's a bit over 14,000 tons. It's a bit shorter than the Japanese ships, at a little under 400 feet long. She was designed to have a crew of around 750 to 780, although in reality, sometimes she would carry over 900. We had 4 12-inch guns again, 2 in a turret, and we had 12 6-inch guns, plus torpedoes and other smaller guns. And again, she's capable of 18 knots. But, yeah, there are limitations on paper. They don't really become apparent. For example, it has a much less range, less efficiency, and its ability to sustain top speed is impacted. But nevertheless, it was one of the largest battleships ever built by Russia, and it was really their first truly modern types built in country. So they had a lot of hopes that these would turn the tide in the Ruso-Japanese War. And this war really was over Port Arthur, at least in the beginning. When basically both countries had claim to it. In the end, Russia nominally ended up with it when France and Britain stepped in, but in exchange Japan was given a large cash sum. But things broke down, and in February 1904 we had the Battle of Port Arthur, which frankly was pretty inconclusive. Both sides suffered relatively small casualties, although the Japanese did lose more sailors than the Russians did. But at this point, the fleet that Russia had in the Pacific didn't have any of the Borodinos. It was all older ships because, well, let's think about how it is and the way Russia would have to transport and go all the way around the Horn of Africa and come back up. And they really wanted Port Arthur because it was a vital warm water port, something that Russia had precious few of. So the earliest engagements were pretty lackluster on both sides, and would kind of kick things off. After the Battle of Port Arthur in 1904, both Fuji and Shikishima would lose their sister ships to mines, actually. Shima would be hit, float for a bit, and then capsize. And Hatsus would just hit and immediately go down. In August, there was the Battle of the Yellow Sea. It was somewhat indecisive, however, a Russian battleship was shot apart, was shelled and hulled and sank, and this was actually the first time in history that a modern battleship was destroyed with gunfire. So, while things were going the Japanese way, they weren't going the Japanese way the whole time. And on October 15th, the 4 available Borodinos would leave Russia. And that's a whole thing. Yeah. They would sail down through Africa, and then they would arrive off Madagascar in January of 1905, and then they would stay there for 2 months. At this point, they were heading for Port Arthur, but they got word that it had fallen, so they changed course to Vladivostok. They would set out after working out some coaling, whatnot, and they would, basically it was kind of a hurry up and wait thing, slower ships, and then coming up into March and April, they started to try to rendezvous with elements from the 3rd Fleet that were still in the Pacific, but these were older ships, much slower speeds. So though, even after they left Madagascar, they would only get so far before they were again waiting around. This time they were kind of near French-held Indochina. So a lot of time was wasted, and this was critical. They had the 4 new ships, really untested, untried. They were also fully laden with coal. And if they had made haste to the Far East, they might have caught the Japanese, because several ships had been damaged in the fighting in 1904 and had to be returned to Japan for repairs. Even the others had to get refurbished and have their guns and ammo. So if the Russians had shown up as quick as possible, it's very likely that several of the key Japanese battleships would have still been moored or still under repair and not available for combat. But as it happens, through various misadventures, what was effectively the Russian Baltic fleet dawdled, and so it wasn't in theater until May of 1905, about which time the Japanese had repaired their ships and had even had time to get some good gunnery training, gunnery practice in. So that, plus their year of fighting, meant that they were learning. They had learned lessons from the Battle of Port Arthur and the Yellow Sea. They had replenished their stocks. They had repaired. They had done a few minor upgrades. They were fresh. They were ready. And they were near home with short supply lines. Whereas the Russian fleet had been burning bad coal had been wasting shells throughout the whole trip, mostly chasing after phantoms, had nearly started a war with Britain on their voyage. Who knows what else got up to? They were tired, they were dirty, they were either in old ships never meant for long ocean voyages, or they were in brand new ships that were never tried and tested. So, yeah. You can already tell how the decisive battle in the Ruso-Japanese War was about to go. On May 27th, 1905, and running into May 28th, the Ruso-Japanese War would have one conclusive battle that would end it. The Battle of Tsushima. Now the treaty, the Portsmouth Treaty that actually ended the war, would not happen until early September, but it was almost a formality at that point. The war was effectively over by June. So what happened at the Battle of Tsushima? In a lot of ways, everything went the way of the Japanese and nothing went right for the Russians. The brand new Borodino class ships had some fundamental flaws in their armor, and they were sitting extremely low in the water, giving them very poor armor protection. Oriel would actually open the battle by firing the first shots, but it was a mistake. She was ordered to halt fire. Next, the flagship, the admiral ship, the Suvorov, would open fire, and they would target Mikasa, which was the Japanese flagship. Sorry, wrong side. There's Mikasa. But everyone would be there. Fuji, Shikishima, Asahi, as well as other ships. So of the 6 original British-built battleships, 4 were available, and Mikasa was the target, and she took a pounding. She would lose a turret, but this left Asahi free to go after the Russian ships. And Fuji, while she did lose a gun, she was the older of the ships, and she would get away pretty free too. The first Russian Borodino to go down, no surprise, was the flagship, the Suvorov. She would be hit quite a few times, lose control, become a burning hulk, but really within the first bit of the battle, all 4 ships had fires on board. But long story short, she was the first to go down, and of her crew of over 920, only about 20 were rescued, and that was because the destroyer had come alongside earlier and taken the wounded off. Everyone else went down with the ship. After that, Alexander III would kind of take over, and then she too would be sunk with all hands. Everyone died. It's very remarkable in a very sad way. Next, Borodino would take charge and be sunk. and of her crew, only one survivor was picked up. So not only did the Russians lose 3 of the 4 ships, and in short order, the human loss of life was appalling. It's really amazing that no one got out. I guess the fires and just everything, but yeah. Not being totally suicidal, Oriel would try to collect the fleet and make a break for it as night was falling, and would actually be successful, at least temporarily. On the Japanese side, Shikishima would actually be pretty well pummeled, but still afloat. Like I said, Fuji would be slightly damaged. Asahi would actually be very, very clean, at least comparatively speaking. And Mikasa would have a lot of dents and dings and holes in her, and going to require some repair, but she made it through. Actually, the Japanese did not lose any ships, and their casualties were very light considering the intensity of the fighting. Speaking of Fuji, she was the reason that this ship, the Borodino, went down. 2 shells from Shikishima actually hit her bridge and started a big fire, and at this point, the Japanese Admiral Tojo ordered ceasefire and break off. I mean, he'd already seen 2 major warships go down with extreme loss of life. He had no desire to see more. He wasn't a bloodthirsty man. The battle was already won for them. So as the ships were turning away, as the line was disengaging, Fuji, already having loaded and primed guns, went ahead and discharged her last salvo just to get him out of the barrels. And one was a lucky hit. One of her 12-inch shells hit below the turret where the armor was weak, which showed how bad the armor coverage was, and this started a fire, which ultimately led to the magazine detonating and a big explosion. So she went under in a hurry, which explains why everyone was lost. So she was almost lost on accident. These ships seemed to just be tin cans, extremely flammable, which makes sense. They'd been sailing for months on coal with dust and everything everywhere without any real cleaning. They hadn't been to a Russian port, a Russian dock in half a year. But yeah. That night, not a whole lot happened. The remaining Russian fleet would kind of break up here and there. Some, like the cruiser Aurora, would escape and actually serve on. And a few others would go to Manila, where they met the Americans. But the remaining Borodino ship, the Eagle, Oriel, would be spotted by first one Japanese task group, and then that would be joined by a second the next day. The Japanese barely had time to open fire before the admiral remaining in charge surrendered because, again, loss of life was appalling. The Japanese captured 5 major warships that day, including the Oriel, the Eagle, and they refurbished them, repaired them, rebuilt them, retrofit them, and put them into service. And she would join the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1907 and be used as a coastal defense and patrol ship in World War I, and actually be the flagship in 1918 when Japan sent its contingent to intercede in the Russian Civil War between the White and the Red Russians. After that, she would be made into a dedicated training and school ship, and then she would be disarmed and eventually hulked in 1922-1923 to comply with the Washington Naval Treaty. And eventually she would be broken up, used for target practice, salvage, whatever, around 1924. Slava would be the only one of the 5 Borodinos to see extensive Russian service, since she wasn't finished until October of 1905. She missed the Ruso-Japanese War. Good on her. Instead, she would serve in Russia in World War I, and she would actually face the German High Seas Fleet. But these weren't good ships. I don't know how else to put it. They maybe if they had more time, but they just had some fundamental issues, design flaws. And the deck was really stacked against Russia. So the Ruso-Japanese War ended, at least effectively, Russia's position as an international naval force, something that it had enjoyed since the time of Peter the Great. That's not to say they wouldn't have a navy. They would even make battleships, for example, the Ganget class, which I do a video on. But once the Soviets took over, they decided they were more concerned with what they considered a green water navy, meaning coastal defense. They would also focus on submarines in the Cold War, having just some cruisers and destroyers, and eventually some light carriers, like the Kiev. So yeah, this was the end of Russia as a great navy power, even if it wasn't necessarily known in 1905. On the other hand, the Ruso-Japanese War, and in particular, the victory at Tsushima, was the beginning of their rise. They'd already shown themselves to be a regional power in the Sino-Japanese War, while defeating Russia, who had been considered to be a formidable navy. Japanese navy. And in 1860, they were even close to the West, so they had rapidly modernized and were becoming not just a regional player, but they were a player in the hemisphere, the whole region, the whole Pacific, even to that extent, the whole world. And they, of course, would take part in World War I, although very much as a secondary role. But they would be on the side of the Allies. Which means all 3 of these models, all 3 of these ships, would have careers after the Ruso-Japanese War. So let's briefly talk about that, and then I'll let you go for the night. So following the Ruso-Japanese War, these ships would all have careers. Fuji would continue on, but since she was the oldest and smallest, she would be the first to be put into coastal defense. She was declared a first-class coastal defense ship in 1910. And she would serve there until she would be turned into a training ship, school ship, even getting classrooms and stuff. She would be stripped down as part of compliance with the Washington Naval Treaty and become a floating barracks in 1923 and be used as a barracks and store ship and all that throughout World War II, actually not being completely scrapped until 1948 Shikishima would follow a similar path. She would be a patrol ship, an occasional transport during World War I. She would be used to support the intervention in 1918 in the Russian Civil War. Then afterwards, she too would be declared a coastal defense ship. But she would only serve briefly before being demilitarized, again in compliance with the Washington Naval Treaty. So let's set her aside. Mikasa would have an interesting post-war career. First, an unfortunate event. Just a week after the Portsmouth Treaty in September of 1905, while she was at her moorings at the Sasebo dockyards, she would have a fire on board, which would lead to an explosion, which would do enough damage that she would actually sink. But it was in shallow water. Japan only had 4 major battleships at this point. Well, 5 if you count the ones from Russia. But anyway, they decided to refloat her and give her a thorough repair and refit. They brought her back up in August of 1906. First they fixed the damage, and then they fixed her, other small issues that happened by sitting underwater for a year. And while they were at it, they decided to replace her original 12-inch main guns and 6-inch secondary guns with more modern versions, more capable versions. They were still 12 and 6-inch respectively, but they were of a longer caliber. She would rejoin the fleet in 1908 and continue to serve through World War I as a patrol ship. And then in 1919-1920, she too was declared a coastal defense ship. And it looked like she would be another victim of the Washington Naval Treaty. She was kind of scheduled to be broken up, scrapped, or hulked. But the Japanese petitioned the other signatories to let them turn her into a museum ship, a historical relic, which they approved in 1923. She started being converted into a museum ship. Her hull was encased in concrete, both to make sure she could never be used again and also for protection. And she was open to the public beginning in 1926 and would remain so until World War II. Unfortunately, following World War II, she was severely neglected for a long time, and she was in pretty piss-poor shape by the 1950s. But a campaign would begin in 1955 to restore her. It was successful. She would be closed up and undergo a lot of work, first opening up again in 1961. And since that time, she's undergone periodic repair and even just a fresh coat of paint here and there. And today, she is the only surviving pre-dreadnought from this era in the entire world. And since she is a British design and of British construction, she has a lot of history to offer. And therefore, is not just important to Japan, but important to all of us. And that leaves us with Asahi. And would you believe that she was still in active service in World War II? The only one of the ships from her era to still be an active military vessel. Well, the Japanese Navy certainly got their money out of Asahi. In 1914, she was declared as a gunnery training ship, and this led to her getting brand new guns in 1917. And these were made in Japan, unlike the originals, which of course were made in the United Kingdom. Then in 1918, she too helped support the Japanese contingent operating in Russia, well, off of Russia. And then in 1921, she was declared a coastal defense ship. So her path looked to be very similar to the rest. But while disarmament began in 1922, it was first decided to make her a transport and training ship, and then a submarine supply ship. By the end of 1923, all of her guns were gone and her armor had been stripped off, and her weight had been reduced down to around 11,500 tons. In 1925, it was decided to make her into a submarine recovery, repair, and salvage ship, a new concept for the time. This refitting and training took a few years, but was done by 1927. And in 1928, she actually got an aircraft catapult. First, they tried using one with compressed air. This didn't work well, so they went to one using gunpowder. And she would serve in this role for some time, although she was officially still in reserve, or put into reserve, I should say. But she was called back out in 1937. It was decided now to make her into a repair ship. But first, she was needed for the Second Sino-Japanese War, and she was given a mission of transporting troops. After that, she would be retrofitted again as her new repair ship role, which was done by the end of 1938. Between 1939 and 1941, she would occasionally go out on patrol. She would sometimes work as a repair ship, and she would sometimes transport troops. In fact, on December 7th, as the Japanese Navy was attacking Pearl Harbor, that's exactly what she was doing, transporting troops over in the Far East. After this, in early 1942, she was stationed in Singapore. And in April, she would actually have what would turn out to be her final mission, her final assignment. She was given the job of repairing the light cruiser Naka, a job which she finished. And then she was ordered to depart the area for her next assignment, so she would leave the region on May 22nd, 1942. She was underway, but on the night of May 25th, she was spotted by the U.S. submarine Salmon. And early the next morning of the 26th, 4 torpedoes were fired at her, 2 of which struck. And as you can imagine, a ship of this age and with this light of armor, at least by World War II standards, assuming the American torpedo would actually detonate, which these did, didn't have much of a chance. So she went to the bottom. The good news is, of her crew of nearly 600, only 16 were lost. The rest were rescued. And that, aside from Mikasa, is finally the last chapter in the story of Japan's first 6 warships, battleships, all pre-dreadnoughts, all based on British designs, and what got Japan kind of into the whole game. Now, in the future, I don't plan to have so many in one video, but these are so similar I didn't really know how to break them apart, and their stories are so intertwined. If they'd just been a little bit more similar to each other, it would have just been one class of 6 ships. But, yeah. I appreciate you tuning in with me. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.